Okay, so this is the review of Chapter 12, Developmental Life Course, Perspectives on Criminality. All right, so some of the basic concepts and early developmental theory. So developmental theories are distinguished because they emphasize the evolution of individuals' criminality over time. So they're not looking at necessarily just the initial onset or the initial deviance, but how does that develop over time? So developmental theories tend to look at the individual as a unit of analysis, and these models focus on various aspects of the onset of the criminality, the frequency of criminality, intensity, persistence, duration, desistance, and all these other aspects of an individual's criminal career. So the onset of offending is when the offender first begins offending, and desistance is when an individual stops committing crimes. So early onset is one of the most important predictors of any of the measures that we have in determining who's most at risk for developing serious violent offending behaviors. So again, frequency is just looking at how often someone's committing offenses or ending up in the system. And the most discussed and researched aspect of this theory is that of offender frequency, which they refer to as lambda. And so estimates of lambda vary greatly. Some estimates are in the high single digits, and some are in the triple digits. So frequency of offending, even with its crime type, varies so widely across individuals that, a lot of people question its use in understanding criminal careers. So it's not quite as valid as the onset. So persistence or duration, again, is like how long you're doing it for. Persistence or duration has become one of the most researched components of this as well. And so a lot of the research studies on life course developmental perspectives show that most individuals who are arrested aren't arrested again. But for those who offend many times, a certain pattern emerges. So those reoffenders, right? This pattern involves an escalation from minor status offending, usually when you're a preteen or in your early teen years, to higher level petty crimes and then to far more serious criminal activity. So this is, this trend isn't disputed, but there's a lot of other issues with these concepts that are still unresolved. So studies haven't determined whether police contact or an arrest becomes an early onset. Most empirical studies look at the age of 14 as the beginning of that. So any arrest or contact prior to that time is considered early onset. So some experts argue that the line should be drawn earlier, maybe at 12, or even later at 16, just developmentally. So, this perspective has recently become one of the most dominant theories in explaining criminality. So, a lot of criminologists rely upon it. All right, so breaking these down a little bit, anti-developmental theory or low self-control theory. So in 1990, Travis Hershey and Michael Gottfriedson proposed a general theory of low self-control. And so they say that low self-control is the primary cause of all crime and deviance. So it's also often referred to as the general theory of crime. So the theory has a significant amount of debate and research in the field based on it, more than pretty much any other contemporary theory of crime. So it's, kind of legit. So this is what the baseline of it. So it basically says the general theory is that self-control has to be established by the time that you're 10 years old. And if you haven't formed any sort of self-control by that time, then an individual will forever exhibit low self-control. So the assumption of the formation of low self-control by age 10 or before is the oppositional feature of the theory, right? So of course that's where it comes from the developmental perspective, because developmental theories are really assuming that people change over time, right? And so general theory assumes that people can take a degree of control over their own decisions. So it's kind of combining those two. So general theory of crime is accepted as one of the most valid theories of crime, but that's probably due to the simplicity of the theory, because it identifies only one factor that causes criminality, which is low self-control, which is a hell of a lot easier to explain than like all of the things that actually go into it, right? So it's important to note that even this theory has developmental component in the sense that it proposes self-control develops at the early years and that it comes from parenting practices, right? So, this is, again, that developmental aspect. So in contrast to Hershey and Gottfriedson's model, Another theoretical model shows that individuals can change their trajectories in terms of crime, meaning that, after age 10. So research shows that sometimes you'll have like an event that can occur, or maybe a realization that lead people to alter their frequency or incidence of offending, sometimes to zero, right? Meaning that something happens and they decide, it changes their perspective and they stop offending, right? So that's kind of, the transition into Sampson and Laub's developmental theory. So this is one of the best known and most researched developmental theoretical models to date. And yeah, it's kind of leaning a little bit upon the last, but it's also, also based on a analysis of one we talked about before from Sheldon and Gluck. So, basically, what they're really arguing is that, as a developmental model, individual stability and change are the primary focus of their theoretical perspective, right? Or foci. Anyway. They emphasize the importance of certain events and life changes that can alter an individual's decision to commit crimes or to not commit crimes, right? So the theory basically is based on social control frameworks. So that's where you're getting like the Sheldon, the Gluck, or whatever. But it also has elements of other theoretical perspectives. So, for example, early antisocial theories also have this idea that's linked to later criminal offending. Some social structure stuff tends to see the social and educational development as what can lead to crimes. So anyway, they're getting this from somewhere is basically the whole point. So basically who you engage with as peers also has an influence on this, which we talked about through control theory. So it's kind of a little bit of that. So what they strongly emphasize is the importance of transitions or specific events that are important to altering long-term trends in behavior, which they call trajectories. So, some of the examples they give in the book, marriage could be one of those trajectories, stable employment, right? Obviously, if you have a really good job, then you're probably not going to want to engage in as much crime because you have more to lose, right? You don't want to lose that job. So, of course, those things are going to make a difference in your perspective, your identity, and then, of course, your behaviors. So, there's a lot other trajectories that aren't quite as specific, but, the ones that they kind of point to often are the specific ones because they're easier to see. But oftentimes there's like a lot of little ones that accumulate into our trajectories. So meaning that it might not be just the marriage, maybe it's the marriage, it's the job, it's having kids, it's whatever it is, right? So those things can change a person's criminal career. And there's a lot of evidence, the research, that people that were once on one path towards a certain form of behavior, in this case, violent crime, can suddenly or halt those transitions due to going through a series of transitions or a trajectory. All right. When it comes to Moffitt's developmental taxonomy, so Moffitt's framework looks at two different kinds of offenders, right? There's adolescence limited. So those are basically pretty much everyone in the general public. So meaning everyone who committed some sort of offense when they were teenagers or young adults. So did you skip school? Did you sneak out? Did you smoke a cigarette? Right? That would be adolescence limited. Like going to a party and having a drink when you're underage, like something like that, right? Something that's pretty common for a lot of people to do. So the offending is usually associated with peers or the desire to engage in activities that, they see adults doing. So part of that's like wanting to be grown up, wanting to be cool, wanting to be part of the crowd, peer pressure, one of us, all that kind of crap. And then there's the life course persistent, right? These are a very small group of offenders, maybe like they estimated to be about 4 to 8% of offenders who are the most violent. Like they are the chronic offenders. They constantly or consistently commit crimes. And so, they argue that these people are committing not just crimes, but the majority of serious violent offenses, such as murder, rape, armed robbery. Like there is a lot of research that validates that when it comes to rape, yes, there are incidents where consent is misunderstood and people don't understand that what they engaged in was rape or sexual assault. But the overwhelming majority of when it comes to offenders for rape are really, there's a lot of serial rapists, right? People that offend over and over and over. They commit the kind of most heinous crimes. So the disposition of life course persistent offenders is often a situation of either, neurological issues or often the environmental factors of coming up in a bad environment, or both, really. So life course persistent offenders begin offending very early in their life and continue to commit crime far into adulthood, even into middle age, where most adolescent limited offenders engage in criminal activity only during their teen and young adult years. So this model really is suggesting there's more than one type of development that can explain criminality. Okay, so then there's Thornberry's interaction model. So this model incorporates a lot of empirical evidence, which is very important because if you're going to have a theory, it should be something you can test. So this is one of the first widely acknowledged models to look at peer associations as a predictor and also as a factor that could influence why people do what they do. So in other words, negative peer influences predict future offending, but offending can then cause even more negative peer influence, which leads to more criminality, right? This kind of spiral. So basically the model, he's looking at social control and social learning models and kind of squishing them together. So he claims that the processes of both social control and social learning affect each other in a type of feedback process. So, there's 5 primary theoretical constructs which he puts together to make this framework that he thinks will explain criminal behavior. So the 5 concepts are the first one, commitment to school. Second one, attachment to peers. Attachment to parents, and belief in conventional values. So these first 3 are taken from social control and bonding theory, which we've talked about before. This idea of like, if you have a connection to these things, you are more likely to not offend because these things are going to have a socializing influence on you to counter criminal activity. And then the other 2 concepts, the adoption of delinquent values and the association with delinquent peers, are both drawn from social learning and differential reinforcement theory. So, and again, these 5 constructs, most criminologists would agree are important when it comes to the development of criminality. But, it's also important as a, rational model of crime. If you think about the idea that, like, if you're not connected to your family, to your school, to your neighborhood, to your environment, if you don't have the same values as people have, and you have friends that don't have those values and are delinquent, then you're probably much more likely to be delinquent, right? But if you have friends that are like squeaky clean and follow the rules, and you believe in the values of the rules, and you have strong commitment to your family and to your school, then you're probably not going to commit crimes, right? So it makes sense on a lot of levels. So he basically argues that engaging in crime leads to hanging out with others that engage in crime, which leads to more crimes, right? What he calls a feedback loop, like this reciprocal effect of becoming more and more deviant. All right, when it comes to policy implications, there's a lot of ways that this could be derived from these theories, right? So the first one they look at is how there should be a focus on prenatal and perinatal stages of life because they're significant and effective interventions that can occur during this time. So meaning if policymakers want to reduce early risk factors for criminality, they should provide universal health care for pregnant women, right? There should be health care for newborn infants through the first few years of their life, because if you didn't have the negative brain neurological effects, which can lead to later criminality, that's obviously, it's going to be a hell of a lot cheaper to provide decent medical care for women than it would be to deal with the criminal justice system and the causes and the consequences of crimes in society. So yeah, it's kind of a cheap intervention. Also, they argue that pregnant women who are addicted to drugs and alcohol should be legally mandated to go through some sort of intervention. So it's not just about kind of criminalizing her for being a drug addict, but also following through and making sure that she stabilizes her life and doesn't let her drug addiction take over and make it so that her children suffer as a result. Because again, they look at it like if you help the kids early on, they're less likely to develop criminality. Also, another part of this is like with the neurological effects is making sure that kids are not exposed to lead or other toxins, especially in areas where these are known to exist. Like this whole situation that kind of became high profile because of the Flint, Michigan issue, where kids are drinking or coming in contact with lead contaminated water, and it causes a lot of brain damage, and it can happen pretty quickly just from a low dose. So this is a huge problem because as Flint, Michigan, of course, we know about this issue, but there's a lot of places around the United States that are poor communities of color where, water supplies are not adequate, or like in the situation with Flint, actually what happened there was really weird. It was like a unelected city manager guy basically said, hey, it'll be cheaper to pull water from the polluted river instead of the aquifer we were getting it from, where we had to pay money. So they switched to the polluted water, which the old pipes, it was so caustic that it stripped the old pipes and put lead into the water. So actually, that's something most people don't realize, is that's still a problem right now within Flint. People still don't have access to clean water. That's a huge problem because, again, you think about the kind of echo effects of how that affects those children, and then what are the likelihood of those children having a good quality of life if they've been mentally stunted through poisoning of their water, right? So, that's one of those things. This should be something we take more seriously. Unfortunately, there's this concept that they call, I talk about in other classes, that they call environmental racism, where predominantly low-income people or people of color tend to be, tend to face the worst situations when it comes to pollution and this kind of toxic environments. So that's like a big problem too, because if these are the most marginalized communities facing this, then they don't have a voice, they don't have a platform, so people don't really know about it as much. But again, this could really affect those kids' futures. And of course, other they talk about in the book implications assign special caseworkers for high-risk pregnancies. So again, to have, if a woman is addicted to drugs and they think that that might impair their child, then make sure that this caseworker is there specifically for them throughout the first few years of this kid's life. Make sure the parent is stable, make sure the child doesn't have any negative neurological effects. Those kind of things are very important. Another intervention they talked about was to have a centralized medical system that provides a flag for high-risk infants who have numerous birth or delivery complications. So the doctors who are seeing them for the first time are aware of their vulnerabilities. So that's a huge issue in general. We really need a medical system that is much more responsive to the needs of patients, right? And that kind of connect the dots between later childhood issues and, high-risk infants and those kind of things. Also, they suggest universal preschool should be funded and provided to all kids because studies have shown that this leads to better performance once they enter school, both academically and socially. Meaning, if you give a kid free preschool, if you give a kid, early childhood education, it's actually very striking at how much that they've done all these longitudinal studies on these kind of programs, and they found that putting a kid in one of these programs very young, 3-4 years old, can affect their likelihood of going to college, right? It's fascinating because the more successful they are in school when they get into school, the better they are at adapting and cooperating within that environment, the more successful they tend to be in school in general, and the more they establish it as a positive part of their identity, right? So providing preschool would often give the opportunity for a lot of kids to in later years, because they formed a better attachment to school, not drop out of school, complete their education, and have a better chance at life, right? So these are those, again, we as a society tend to not connect the early childhood stuff to the adult stuff, right? But that is the case, right? And if a lot of this research pans out and shows that these interventions could be helpful in, making sure the next generation has this much less of offenders, that's a positive step that definitely can be taken. And as much as it does cost money in the now, it will cost a lot less money in the future, not having as much criminality plaguing society, right? And not as much traffic within the criminal justice system. So, there those kind of interventions that um, need to be taken in order to prevent, future generational issues.